And in this video, we take a look at some alternative theories as to how this crime could have been committed. We take a look at the different entry and exit points to the crime scene in question, and did anyone really travel down the original route towards the Range Rover on the evening of December the 6th? Now let's start this video by my first impressions when I started to look into this case maybe some 2 or 3 years ago now. Obviously my first port of call was looking through the statements concerning this case, watching the documentaries which were made on the Essex boys' murders, and everything seemed to tell the same story. Really there was just one way into Workhouse Lane and one way out. So the impression I got early on when looking at this case was that there was a single vehicle track which went from the A130, the main road in Rettendon, down that single farm track to where Tucker, Tate and Rolfe lay dead in the Range Rover. So then imagine my surprise after months and months of reading into this case, hours and hours being spent trawling through the statements concerning this case, that when I first arrived in Rettendon back in 2018, I believe it was now, that I realised that it wasn't just a simple case of this single track going down to the Range Rover, but that there were multiple entry and exit points which could have been used by someone who had committed this murder. Now back then I become in a way fascinated by this alternative lane which leads up to where the Wheatsheaf pub car park used to be. Now you should be able to see in front of you a photograph of this lane in question. And this is a lane, as I've said, which leads up to where the Wheatsheaf pub car park was located. Now, for those of you who may be new to this case, maybe you've just stumbled across the Essex boys case, why the Wheatsheaf pub car park is of particular importance is that this is where both Jack Womes, one of the men who was ultimately convicted of these murders, and also Darren Nichols, the guy who was supposedly the getaway driver that night, this is where both of these individuals state that they were on the evening of December the 6th. So this area, this place which used to be the Wheatsheaf pub car park, has always been a particular place of interest. Now, as I say, once I first visited the crime scene, when I made my first trip there back in 2018, it really started to open up different avenues, in my mind at least, as to how this crime may have been committed. In this video, we're going to go through a few of those. Firstly, we'll start, as I've said, with the alternative lane theory. Then we'll take a look at some of the other entry and exit points which may have been used in order to commit this crime. But let's start, as I say, with the alternative lane. Now, the reason I thought that this one was a better choice in terms of a entry and exit point for committing this triple murder is the fact that it offers protection from both left and right for the whole duration of the lane. Now, remember that this lane runs along the back of White's House Farm and goes directly into what was the Wheatsheaf pub car park. The reason I found this alternative lane potentially a better choice than the one detectives believe was used is the fact that when we take a look at that original lane, when we take a look at the one the detectives believe was used, the one that the Range Rover actually travelled down, this one, in my opinion, is fraught with danger. Bearing in mind that this murder was supposedly committed just before 7 p.m. during rush hour on a weekday next to a busy A road, which used to be back then the main road through to Southend. There's most certainly the possibility of someone seeing a car parked up at the start of the lane, and even if you approach from the direction that Darren Nichols claims he did, then you would have had to have stopped traffic more than likely in order to have actually turned down that lane. Now, surely if you were planning this, just put yourself in Michael Steele and Jack Womes' position. You're travelling from the halfway house. The last thing that you're going to want to do at around 7 p.m. or just before 7 p.m. is stop traffic coming the opposite direction in order to turn down a small farm track. Now let's just say for argument's sake that they got incredibly lucky, that they came down the hill and there was nothing coming on the other side of the road which allowed them to turn straight down into Workhouse Lane. Now that would have been a streak of luck, but something that surely must have been factored in to this trip. You know, coming from the halfway house from that direction is going to cause you a lot of problems when trying to access the start of Workhouse Lane. When looking at committing a crime during this time period, surely you must be fearful of potential eyewitnesses. Now, if we go back to Darren Nichols' statement just for one moment, he originally claimed that he dropped Jack Holmes off on the left-hand side of the road. But you can see here, it's basically just a very small grass verge, and there wouldn't be anywhere to stop coming down that sort of blind hill. You wouldn't be able just to pull over on the side of the grass verge and allow Jack Holmes to get out. He later changed his story to say that he actually turned into the lane where Jack Holmes was dropped off. He span his car round, then came back out onto the A130. Now, whatever the truth is in that part of the story, if a vehicle did in fact travel down Workhouse Lane coming from that direction, then it really was a piece of naive planning on behalf of whoever committed this crime. Thinking that you could travel from the halfway house and approach the lane from that side of the road and then cut down there without being seen is incredibly risky. But using that lane, in my opinion, is risky in general. The fact that we're looking at, as I've said, rush hour traffic, even if you approached from the other side of the road, if you were driving on the left-hand side of the road towards the bottom of the hill where the hill starts and you turned left into Workhouse Lane, you're still going to more than likely have to stop traffic. This was a concealed entrance. Now, the fact we don't have anything forensically, the fact we don't have anything from an eyewitness account saying that they saw a vehicle turning into that lane, a Volkswagen Passat or any other type of vehicle travelling down Workhouse Lane, the fact that we have nothing forensically or scientifically or whatever to back up Darren Nichols' version of events tells me that there are other possibilities here. It's worth looking into these other avenues as to where the perpetrator or perpetrators of this crime could have entered and exited the crime scene. So going back to the alternative lane, why would this have been, in my opinion, a much better choice than the main road straight down into Workhouse Lane? Well, as I said earlier, it offers coverage both left and right, very high bushes either side, all the way down the duration of that lane. Now, when I've been there, I've probably walked that lane around 4 or 5 occasions over the past few years. There is evidence that that lane is in use, not only by the farmers, but by dog walkers. But you could equally say that regarding the rest of the lane in question. You could say that the start of the lane, where the Range Rover travels down, that part of the lane is also used by the public. So for me, that other part of the lane, the alternative lane which leads to the Wheatsheaf pub car park, isn't exactly more risky in terms of coming across maybe a dog walker or a member of the public whilst either entering or exiting that crime scene. What the alternative lane also offers is a place to wait and hide whilst awaiting the arrival of the Range Rover. You'll be able to see a little cut-in here, which was still there actually in 1995. This little cut-in at the end of the alternative lane allows you to stay hidden from the Range Rover on the left-hand side. Now, most people believe, at least the detectives believe, that someone was waiting on the right-hand side of the Range Rover. Yet I believe it's more than likely that they were waiting on the left-hand side, potentially the other side of the trees or bushes, where they could come out, walk around the back of the Range Rover and execute Tucker, Tate and Rolfe. And as I say, what's interesting is that little cut-in which leads to that smaller field there is still there to this day. Someone could have entered via the alternative lane, cut into that small little field. They would have been hidden by the trees and bushes where they could have awaited the arrival of the Range Rover. The problem we have, like a lot of things in this case, is that we don't have any crime scene photographs taken of that field, and we don't have any photographs taken, any crime scene photographs taken of the alternative lane. Now, some people are of the opinion that whoever killed Tucker, Tate and Rolfe, and bearing in mind this is a smaller section of the population, but some people believe that the perpetrator or the killer, the murderer, approached from the front of the vehicle, from beyond the locked 5-bar gate. Now, what tells me that this isn't really an avenue to follow up on or isn't really likely a possibility is the way that the bodies are found. And I think that's the key in all of this. When we take a look at how the bodies were discovered, there must have been an element of surprise, a huge element of surprise in these murders. So I think you'll agree that the likelihood of anyone openly approaching the Range Rover from the front of the vehicle from beyond the locked 5-bar gate is highly improbable. So that leaves us with the left of the Range Rover, the right of the Range Rover, and obviously the rear. Now, if someone had approached from the alternative lane, I guess the hardest or most difficult part of that, if they travelled from the alternative lane straight down towards the Range Rover, is the fact that it's quite a distance to travel. So what I believe is a possibility is, as I just said earlier, that someone was hiding towards the left-hand side of the Range Rover, probably the other side of the bushes and trees. Then they came out and executed Tucker, Tate and Rolfe. There's also the possibility that someone may have been hiding to the right of the Range Rover. Now, this is where an area of trampled ground was discovered by the detectives. But there's also talk that this area of disturbed undergrowth was caused by a reporter who gained access to the crime scene. Now, interestingly, just because they couldn't have approached directly from the front of the Range Rover from beyond the locked 5-bar gate, that doesn't mean they couldn't have accessed the crime scene from this direction. Now, this is a common misconception that really the only way down to the Range Rover is via Workhouse Lane. And that isn't actually the truth. If we take a look at a more aerial shot of this area, there are countless different roads, different lanes that you can use in order to access these fields, which all lead on to this alternative lane, which is part of Workhouse Lane and leads down to the Range Rover. So it is totally feasible that someone could have actually gone even further afield in order to get to the crime scene. They could have gone from somewhere like Rectory Lane, which is where Billy Jasper claimed he was dropped off, or he dropped someone off, I should say, on the evening of December the 6th. It's easily accessible from that lane or other lanes adjoining it. Now, if you are a believer that this was a crime which was committed by a professional, then you would imagine that going a little bit further afield, maybe travelling a mile across farmland, wouldn't actually be that much of a big deal, considering that it gives you the ultimate protection in terms of potential eyewitnesses or maybe accidentally stumbling across a member of the public. That's not going to happen when you're travelling across fields like these. And as I said, what is interesting is that when you travel down that alternative lane, there's a very small type, not like a bridge, but it's basically two planks of wood which lead into this other field. That field then leads onto a multitude of other fields which join onto other roads and other lanes, as I've just said. So really what we're looking at here is access to the Range Rover from 360 degrees. Just because they may not have approached from the front of the vehicle does not mean that they didn't access the crime scene from that particular direction. Now, as most of you will know, the investigation early on was really just adamant that one of these murderers, one of these perpetrators, had travelled down in the Range Rover with the 3 deceased men, and there was more than likely someone already lying in wait to the right-hand side of the Range Rover as we look at it. But just talking about the different avenues, the different entry points and exit points to the Range Rover, it makes me wonder why these other avenues weren't explored particularly thoroughly. We have no crime scene photographs of the alternative lane. We have no crime scene photographs beyond the locked 5-bar gate. Yet both of these directions are, in my opinion, quite feasible for someone to enter and exit the crime scene.